Good morning. Well, we've had a couple of good days. Thank you all. I know some of you have been here the whole time, and we've a lot of media interest in the subjects we're covering, and I think the country is learning that conservatives do have some great ideas that could make a better life for every American. That's the whole point of what we're doing here today. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, who is just as comfortable on the cover of a magazine as he is filibustering the Senate. When he was running for office, the Washington establishment was afraid that if he got here, he would cause trouble. Their fears have been well-founded. I'm very proud that I supported him when it wasn't cool. I was told I was stupid, he couldn't get elected, and I'm grateful that he has proved all the critics wrong, that Rand Paul, I think, has been a fresh face on the political scene, and I think very important to the conservative movement. I have said a number of times that the only majority that's left for freedom-minded Americans is a majority that comes from welding a lot of the libertarian ideas with conservative ideas. I believe that the libertarian concepts of individualism, self-reliance, and free markets are certainly consistent with the foundation of conservative thought. And if we can weld with those libertarian foundations, the conservative values that build a strong society and the guarantees of a strong defense, that we will have the majority of Americans who understand how do we build a stronger country, a brighter future, and more opportunity for every American. Rand Paul represents that in many ways, and he's shown as he goes around the country that folks who are not traditionally interested in politics are interested in a lot of the things that he says and talks about, which is very important to our movement. He's attracted millennials. He's spoken on college campuses. He's shown that our ideas are persuasive when presented in a persuasive way. So we are honored and excited to have Senator Rand Paul here at the Heritage Foundation. He's been here many times since I've been at Heritage, speaking on a number of issues. And today, I think he's here to probably stir you up just a little bit more than he has before. So please welcome Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I think you're doing a great job, and Heritage continues to grow. I think they say online we've got maybe 20, 25,000 people watching online. And I asked Jim laughingly if this was off the record and I could say anything I want. Could I just be frank? And he said, yeah, go ahead. Nobody's going to be in there from the media. So here goes. I thought you hear a lot of speeches and everybody's going to give you lots of speeches and you may have already heard a lot. I'd like to make it a little more interactive, so we're going to poll the crowd to begin with. Media and cameramen, you may participate also. I'd like to know who in the crowd thinks that judicial restraint is a great philosophy versus judicial activism. We'll start with judicial restraint. Who in the crowd thinks that your legal philosophy would be judicial restraint? This is going to be a tough sell. How many people think judicial activism is the way to go, and that's really what we should have as an activist court? Nobody. This is really going to be a tough sell. All right, does anybody know why Justice Roberts did not strike down Obamacare? Judicial restraint. So I guess everybody here is for Obamacare, right? And thinks that the court should stay the heck out of Obamacare, and Obamacare, was just fine because the majority wanted it. In fact, that's what Justice Roberts said. He said that we should not get in the way of the majority. Do you know where that comes from? That comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great progressive, back in the Lochner case. When he dissents in the Lochner case, what does Oliver Wendell Holmes says? He says that the court has no business getting in a way to what the majority will is. We should leave it up to the majority. So if you're for judicial restraint, I guess, then what happens when a legislature does bad things? What happens when legislature says, well, we're going to pass Jim Crow laws throughout most of the 19th century, most of the 20th century? Should we have an activist court that comes in and overturns that? So it goes back. Can we have the first slide? The only slide. I won't bore you with a lot of slides, but we have one slide. Where's it going to be? Oh, it's going to be I can't see it, so that's not going to help me any. So we have a timeline, basically. We go back and we start in 1905 with Lochner, and we go all the way through Obamacare. And the question is, in each of these cases, what should conservatives be for, restraint or activism? So we go back to Lochner, and in the Lochner case, state legislatures were becoming more progressive, and they were restricting the right or the liberty of contract. And so what happened is you had an activist court in the Lochner case that rules 5-4 and says states can't interfere with the right to contract. So the question is, are you for activism or restraint when it comes or when it is with regard to state governments interfering with the liberty to contract? We move on a little bit later and we get into the New Deal. And here it's not state governments, it's the federal government. The federal government's passing all kinds of laws, assuming new powers that weren't essentially in the Constitution. So you once again have an activist court in the beginning. Until FDR got his way, you have an activist conservative court who overturns federal laws, one after another, until finally you get a majority of FDR appointees who say, oh no, judicial restraint is the way to go. But then you move on a little bit longer, and as you come out of the Depression, you go into the time where we're looking at Brown versus the board, and we're looking at institutionalized either racism or separation or segregation. What's the position of judicial restraint? Position of judicial restraint is let the states do whatever they want. Is that the conservative position? I frankly think it's not my position. I think if the states do wrong, that we should overturn them. That there is a role for the Supreme Court to mete out justice. The 14th Amendment gives the Supreme Court, it gives the federal government a role in saying the states can't do certain things. There's a book called The Conscience of the Constitution by Timothy Sandefur, which I think is a great book because he talks about it in that if we were to say, well, gosh, we believe in just states' rights, the federal government has no role in the states, well, could you be basically in favor of what John Calhoun said? Not only John Calhoun supported slavery, but John Calhoun supported sort of a tyranny of state government. He thought state government could do anything it wants. Is that sort of the liberty position? Is that the conservative limited government position that we believe so much in a small federal government that there is no role nationally to say to a state government they can't do certain things? So it comes to Brown, I'm not a judicial restraint guy either. I'm a judicial activist when it comes to Lochner. I'm a judicial activist when it comes to the New Deal. But I'm also a judicial activist when it comes to Brown. I think the federal government was right to overturn state governments that were saying that separate but equal is fine. Plessy versus Ferguson's a mistake, all right? Plessy versus Ferguson is judicial restraint. So we get to Brown, I'm an activist. All right, then we go to the next one. What's the big bugaboo? What's the next one we talk about when we want to know about activism versus restraint? It's Griswold. And you say, why are we even having this discussion? Does any of this have anything to do with politics or current events? Does anybody remember George Stephanopoulos' question in the presidential debates last time? They asked them all, what do you think about Griswold? Well, and a lot of people didn't know what Griswold was probably. But Griswold had to do with birth control. The state government said you can't sell birth control to women. And so if you're a states' rights kind of person, you say, I guess, hands off. If you believe in judicial restraint, you're like, let the states do what they want. That's a state right. Or you might say, well, individuals have rights also, and states can't tread upon individual rights. And then you might say, well, maybe I am for Griswold. Maybe I am for overturning the state law that says you can't have birth control. And so there's a question again. Are you an activist or restraint? Some say, well, Griswold led to Roe. I guess you're for Roe also. Well, in Roe, you actually have a competition of rights, I think. You have a competition of rights between a mother and a child. So it's a little bit different than just whether or not you're restricting someone's liberty, because I think there are two individuals involved. Well, the other side would say there's not, but I don't think Roe is as clear-cut as far as restraint or activism. Why is this pertinent? Because we move all the way up to Obamacare. When we get to Obamacare, whether he believes it or not, I don't know, but Justice Roberts laid down the gauntlet and said judicial restraint is why the majority can do whatever they want, basically. Not only did he say that, he basically said that if there are two arguments, two equal arguments for whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional, whether it's a tax or a penalty, we just have to accept that basically the presumption is of constitutionality. This kind of gets back to this idea of restraint. If we believe in judicial restraint, we presume the majority is correct. We presume that laws are constitutional until we can prove otherwise. Now, there is a school of thought that thinks differently. Randy Barnett writes about something of this. He talks about the presumption of liberty, that maybe we should start out with a presumption of liberty. I liken it to sort of saying, well, maybe we should be presumed innocent until found guilty. Maybe we should presume to be free until we are restricted. Yes, I've got one convert. Yes. My point is really not to try to convert you from judicial restraint to judicial activism, but to think about it. Because I think it's not as simple as we make it sound. We say we don't want judges writing laws. Well, I don't want judges writing laws either, but do I want judges to protect my freedom? Do I want judges to take an activist role in defense of liberty? Do I want them to presume liberty and put the burden on the government to prove constitutionality? I think this is important, and it became very important in the case with regard to Obamacare. In that, basically, Justice Roberts says that it's not his role to replace the majority will. Now, some of you might say, well, I'm still for judicial restraint. I don't care about any of those cases. We just need a better majority. That is an argument. But the question has to come also if you don't have a better majority. If you have a Jim Crow majority in the South, does the court have a role in overturning something where a person's individual rights are at stake? I think they do. I think it's an important debate because ultimately ideas are important. I think it was Victor Hugo that said that ideas are sometimes really more important than strong armies. That basically ideas are the presupposition behind all of this, that precede all of this and really empower all of us. I think as we look forward to what kind of government we want or what kind of role we think government has, what kind of role the judiciary has, it's important to decide and to examine ourselves whether for restraint or activism with regard to the court. Another constitutional question we have is on the separation of powers. And I think this is an equally important question. It's a legislative question and possibly a judicial question as well. There's a professor from Tufts who wrote recently, and he said that basically the separation, there's an equilibrium that's supposed to be there between the different powers, between the different branches, but we're having a collapse of the separation of powers. We're having a collapse of this equilibrium. Our founding fathers talked about there being sort of an ambition, that we would pit one ambition against another. An ambition for the legislature should be an ambition that is pitted against the ambition of the presidency. The hope was, and many times in our history, this ambition was, I think, beyond party label. Unfortunately, I think now things are so partisan that if it's a Democrat president usurping authority, all Democrats will support them. But if it's a Republican president usurping and taking on too much executive power, all Republicans will support him, instead of what our founding fathers intended was that Congress would object to having its power taken by the executive branch. And these ambitions would be pitted back and forth, and those ambitions would push us forward towards more of an equilibrium. It isn't just on immigration that the president has usurped and created and brought upon the executive branch power that's not there. It is also in Obamacare amending the rules. We're going to have another ruling in the Supreme Court on that coming up. But it's also on the power of war. The power to declare war was absolutely and without question given to the legislature. We've been at war now for 5 months and no vote in Congress. So before Christmas, I decided I would declare war. And I decided I would declare war on a water bill. And people were like, why is he trying to declare war on a water bill? And I said, well, it's my only avenue for having any power around here. I'm not chairman of the committee. I don't get to decide the agenda. Well, they've been working on this water bill for 6 years. And as Jim will attest to, sometimes they get pretty annoyed if you try to amend something they're trying to do. So I amended it with the declaration of war for ISIS. Because I said, I think they are a threat. I think, frankly, they're a threat to our embassy in Baghdad. They're a threat to our consulate in Erbil. And frankly, it's been pretty apparent that they're a threat to Americans by killing Americans. And there should be a debate. This shouldn't happen with the president. The president shouldn't do this alone. And so these debates have to go on. And to me, I think what's more important than belonging to one political party or another is the ideas of the Constitution and how the whole goal of the Constitution was in limiting power, in trying to not let too much power gravitate to one body or to one person. While I'm here in Washington, in the future, as long as I'm here, that will be my overriding goal, is to try to limit power and to try to keep too much power from gravitating to one person or body. And I think this is above and beyond all partisan politics, and I will continue as long as I'm given that privilege. Thank you very much. And I would ask people to raise hand if I converted you from restraint to activism, but I'm afraid to.
Ray, why
So,
don't we sit
all
down
right.
so we can both have microphones
All right.
here? Are they both on? All right. We'll take some questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My question is very simple. Why does Jennifer Rubin of Washington Post, why is she obsessed with you? Okay, my question is about ISIS. I asked this question to former Israeli Prime Minister Barak. I guess that which president is smarter, the one who blew up $1 trillion in Iraq, gave a couple of thousand of American lives, or the president who is saying, okay, these people are crazy, let them fight with each other, we don't have to get involved in that. He didn't answer in public, but if you want to answer, if you want to know what was his answer, I can tell you privately. So I'm a Sunni Muslim, so my question is very simple. If I want to die, how smart it is for you to pick a fight for nothing with me. It's absolutely, see, Muslims, they are sadists, they are crazy, they are irrational, they live in the past, they don't live in the present or future. What do Americans have to gain by picking up a fight for nothing?
Good question.
I guess the way I would look at it is, and I say this often because I think it bears repeating, I think there's a long war going on. The long war, in some ways, is Sunni versus Shia, but it's also within the Islamic faith, there's a war going on between what I call civilized Islam and barbaric Islam. And some conservatives like to criticize the president and say, oh, why is he being so nice to Islam? I think sometimes what he's trying to do is point out that there are differences, because if you want to paint with a broad brush that everybody in Islam is an enemy of the United States, you're talking about a horrific, terrible kind of war with, you know, 1 billion people hating America. I don't think that's true. I think that the vast majority of Islam is peace-loving and civilized. But if it's 5 or 10% of Islam, that's a lot of people, and that's a big problem. The long war is not only Sunni versus Shia, but there's also a long war between a barbaric form of Islam against mainstream Islam and against the West. I think no matter what we do, we have to defend ourselves. So, you know, printing cartoons shouldn't engender people murdering you. And so we do have to defend ourselves. France has to defend themselves. We have to defend ourselves. We also have to defend our diplomatic missions around the world. I put a lot of blame at the feet of Hillary Clinton for not defending the embassy or the consulate in Benghazi. I think she did a terrible job. And I think that it's inexcusable, basically, when you're asked for security that you not provide it. That is the job of the commander-in-chief, and that's the job of the executive branch. The same goes, though, for Erbil or for Baghdad. While I don't want to be in the middle of the long war, because I don't think there really is an answer in this long war, and that much of this war should be left to be fought by the Middle East, at the same time, we can't leave our embassies unprotected. So we have a couple choices. We either come home completely and bring everything home, or we defend our embassies and our interest. I think at this point, what I would say is we defend our interests. But that doesn't mean that we have to be involved in every war and skirmish. And I just end by saying one thing. If there's any one true thing that I think is irrefutable and that the facts really support, is that every time we've gotten involved to topple a secular dictator, it's been replaced with chaos and the rise of radical Islam. And that would be in Hillary's war in Libya. This would also be, though, in the Republican war in Iraq. I think what's over there now is less stable than before. And so I think there are more problems with the rise of Iran as a problem, because there is no counterbalance in Iraq anymore. And so some of these problems are insolvable. The only thing that I think we have to know from our perspective is we should defend our country and our people.
Senator Paul makes an important distinction. It's something we've looked at a lot at Heritage. I mean, there is political Islam, welding itself with the powers of government, perverting the basic religion itself, and there is a civilized, more, I guess, religious Islam. And making that distinction is very important, I think, in solving the problem itself. Some other questions for Senator Paul. Yes, sir.
While I agree with your definition of an activist judge, that might not have been the definition I had in my mind when you asked the question. But to your point about separation of powers and the intention of the Founding Fathers, how do we get that into a pop culture or a everyman definition that we can understand? Because that does transcend partisan. When you bring those topics up and get out of the labels of it, and really what that means, I think we easily transcend partisan politics. But some people don't understand that, and we fall into the Democrats or nice Republicans in Maine 2 seconds, and we end up in this mess. How do we get more?
I think one simple sentence I would say is that unelected bureaucrats shouldn't write laws. But who are the unelected bureaucrats working for? That's a separation of powers issue. All of the bureaucracy of government works for the president. And so we have abdicated our role as Congress. People say, well, Obamacare was 2,000 pages. That's so long. Well, yeah, that's pretty long. But the regulations are already 20,000 pages. So much of it's being done without our knowledge, but without us doing what we need to do. So there's this debate right now over defunding the immigration and the executive order. I'm all for that. However, I'm for that and about 1,000 other things on every bill. I want 1,000 instructions or thousands of instructions on every appropriation bill. And people say, oh, you're just trying to tie the hands of the president. That's our job. I don't care if it's a Republican president. The power of the purse, when people talk about the power of the purse, those are instructions. We've been writing sort of outlines of bills, sending them to the president, and no matter which party they are, they do whatever they want. But as a consequence, they do many things that we didn't intend. I also think that regulations that are written that are very expensive, like over $100 million, ought to come back. Jim was the lead sponsor of something called the REINS Act when he was in the Senate. I have it now. It says that any regulation written by a bureaucrat, written by another branch of government that is very, very expensive, has to come back and be voted on to become law by the Congress. That would go a long way towards reasserting our authority and reasserting the balance of powers.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Senator Paul, I thought that you're your father was one of the big founders of the Libertarian Party, and that one of the main thrusts was you were against regulations, and I'm glad you're slowing down as president by the regulations. But are you for regulations in a constitutional way rather than just more red tape? I thought that was what most libertarians were against.
And I'll give you an example of that. We passed a law, that the Clean Water Act, that says that no one can discharge pollutants into a navigable stream. I'd vote for that. I think that if you've got a company and you have benzene and you're dumping it in the Ohio River, not only should you be punished, if you are doing it purposely, you probably should be in prison for doing that. So I am for that regulation. That's a federal government regulation. However, that was passed in the 1970s. And it says discharging pollutant into a navigable stream. Over time now they've defined dirt as a pollutant and your backyard as a stream. And we now spend $100 million policing private property, and I think we do so much to harass private property owners that we've forgotten about the stuff we're supposed to be doing, which is the Ohio River and the Great Lakes and the oceans. So there is a role for government in communal property, but we've gone way too far in what we've done to individuals. One quick example, Ken Lucas put clean dirt on his own land to raise the elevation to sell lots in southern Mississippi. He's been in prison for 10 years. He was 70 when he went to jail. He's now 79 and still in prison for putting clean dirt on his own land. That is a crime, and whoever put him in jail is the one who really ought to be in jail.
Okay, one more question, then we better call it.
Senator, I was just at an event with Americans for Limited Government, and they were making a libertarian case against TPA, that it was ceding too much power to the president. Do you agree with that? What's your view of this?
I have mixed feelings some on, you're talking about the authority that's given for the trade agreements. And what's the TPA, what's the actual acronym stand for again?
Trade Promotion Authority.
Trade Promotion Authority. There is an argument to be made by some on the separation of powers that by giving this authority to the president, that you've taken power that should be the Congress's. There's also, I guess, another argument that these are really treaties and they ought to be actually done as treaties, and they're not. They're done by simple majority. But I'm also a big believer in free trade, that I think free trade is a good thing. So there have been libertarians or libertarian conservatives, my father included, who voted against some of the trade deals because they felt like they gave up sovereignty to international bodies. I think that's a valid point. I have voted for the trade deals, though, because like a lot of things in Washington, I've weighed the good and the bad, And I think the good of trade has caused me to vote for things that I think aren't perfect, basically. I think the perfect way is that we would lessen our trade barriers and do that through the sovereignty of the Congress. But unfortunately, I think that what we've been offered to vote on has not exactly been that. But trade has helped people, and trade helps even the poorest among us more than anybody else. I think the average person who shops in a Walmart-type store, or Walmart, they're everywhere, saves about $800 or $900 a year because of free trade.
Good. Let's thank Senator Rand Paul.
All right. Thank you to Senator Paul. All right, we're going to switch topics here for a moment. We're lucky to have Congressman Jim Bridenstine, who's a fast-rising star within the conservative movement here. He has won admirers throughout the conservative policy world for his adherence to principle, his determination not to play the Washington game, his commitment to represent the ideals and values of his constituents who sent him here in the first place. Speaking of those constituents, one of the things that I've loved about Representative Bridenstine is that he's been so close with the people who sent him to Washington. As you know, Heritage Action has what we call a Sentinel program, where around the country we have activists in different districts who commit to holding their members accountable and helping them when they do the right thing to withstand the political heat. And we have some of those Sentinels in the crowd today, and we're proud of that. And one of the things I love about Congressman Bridenstine is just the way that he interacts with his constituents. He is committed to ensuring that those grassroots activists are in an open process with him, and making sure that they are a part of the legislative process. Today, Congressman Bridenstine is going to lay out a conservative vision for national defense. It is, after all, the proper role of the federal government to protect its citizens, to secure our liberties from foreign threats, and ensure our ability to live in peace and security. At Heritage, we're three legs of the stool conservatives, and as such, we are happy to have Congressman Bridenstine, another three legs of the stool conservative, here to share this vision with us. Please welcome Congressman Bridenstine to the stage.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and certainly to talk about foreign policy, national security issues. I'm a Navy pilot, as a lot of people in this room know, and I can tell you firsthand, there's a reason aircraft carriers, when they're sitting in the Persian Gulf, they have targeting solutions on them by terrorist states, and there's a reason that these aircraft carriers don't ever get targeted. It's because of a strong deterrent. People know that if you target an American aircraft carrier, there will be a response. It will be lethal, it will be decisive, it will be quick, and we're not going to call and ask for permission. That is what deterrence is all about. And that's why I'm honored to be here to talk about national security and the implications for our country going forward. I'd like to start by thanking Mike Needham and Heritage Action for the great work they do. We have, from time to time, in Congress, dealt with issues ranging from cutting aircraft carriers to providing foreign terrorists more constitutional rights than we as American warfighters get. Heritage comes down on the right side of these issues every time. They hold members accountable for their votes, and certainly it's important that groups like Heritage Action do this kind of activity for the benefit of our nation. Yesterday, diplomats from France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine canceled peace talks. There were going to be peace talks today. The United States was not involved in those peace talks, but they got canceled. I would attest that if the United States had been involved in those peace talks, they might not have been canceled. When America leads, people follow. And when America isn't present, things fall apart quickly. In this particular case, those peace talks fell apart. The issue of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea is not even on the table in these peace talks. And certainly any peace talks that have happened up till now, there's always ceasefires, but the ceasefires very quickly break down when the separatists in eastern Ukraine once again resume their activities. The question is, how do we as America view ourselves when we outsource our diplomacy to Berlin and Paris, which is what happened in this particular case. And when you look at our European allies, they're understandably right now distracted. Of course, what's happening in Paris is a distraction. The financial crisis in the Eurozone is a distraction. And yet Kiev is calling out to the United States asking for help, asking for support. And the Obama administration's response has been silence. Last September, a joint session of Congress listened as Ukraine's president, Petro Poroshenko, pled for America to stand up to Vladimir Putin's war machine. It was an amazing speech, and as a member of Congress, this is one of the times when I was, I got to tell you, it was awe-inspiring for me to see him stand up and plead for America to stand up to Vladimir Putin's war machine. The words he said, he called for America to, quote, be equal to its natural and manifest role. He called for America to be equal to its manifest and natural role. When you think about Americans today, we don't hear ourselves talking in this way, yet here is a leader of a foreign country calling on America to be equal to its natural and manifest role. Can a commander-in-chief whose definition of engagement is leading from behind even begin to grasp what Poroshenko means by America fulfilling her natural and manifest role? The question is, how did we get here? The Obama administration simply does not realize what many in this room realize, that weakness is provocative. On the one hand, weakness discourages our allies and forces them to search for more assertive and reliable partners. On the other hand, weakness encourages adversaries to continue bad behavior both abroad and at home. The root cause of the Ukraine crisis lies in the president's failed reset policy with Russia. It goes all the way back to the reset policy. In fact, the day after President Obama got elected, Russia announced the deployment of mobile theater ballistic missiles into Kaliningrad, a Russian enclave wedged between Lithuania and Poland. That was the day after his election. After pledging his support for, quote, a world free of nuclear weapons, unquote, President Obama signed a disastrous nuclear arms control treaty with the Russians. New START's caps on strategic nuclear warheads and launchers are low enough to force the United States to divest weapons, but high enough for Russia to continue to increase its operational stockpile. We are drawing down, they are plussing up. Russia has taken advantage of New START to launch a full-scale nuclear modernization program. While the U.S. nuclear arsenal atrophies, Russia is fielding next-generation ICBMs and new submarine-launched ballistic missiles carried aboard brand-new strategic ballistic missile submarines. Putin sensed Obama's desperation to enter into an agreement, and he is pressing his advantage. Russia is also violating the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. Back in 2008 was when we first started hearing about this in open press reports. Yet New START was ratified in 2010. So we knew that the Russians were in violation of a treaty, and yet we signed yet another treaty that strengthened them and weakened us in 2010. The Obama State Department conveniently waited until just last July to declare that the Russians were even in violation of the INF Treaty. I have received numerous classified briefings on this issue. A number of us in Congress have. And I can tell you, all of us are terribly worried and alarmed about this issue. In over 4 years, the administration has done nothing in response to Russia's INF violations, including provide any political or military guidance to European Command or NATO. Beyond arms control, missile defense represents another strategic area where Obama's weakness has provoked Russian aggression. In September 2009, the president caved to Russian pressure and canceled strategic missile defenses planned for Poland and the Czech Republic. This was back in 2009. In March of 2013, the president canceled long-range Standard Missile 3 interceptors, SM-3 interceptors in Europe. That was in 2013. You probably remember in 2012 when he met with Medvedev, he said, wait till after my next election, I'll have the flexibility. What he was talking about is the flexibility to bring down those SM-3 missiles, those long-range SM-3 missiles. Other Russian crimes the Obama administration has abetted form a long and depressing list. If you look at the Russian invasion of Georgia. You still have South Ossetia and Abkhazia occupied by Russia. In fact, they're building a Berlin Wall type environment where people can't travel back and forth inside of the nation of Georgia. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are now going to be permanently separated regions. If you look at the Nagorno-Karabakh region in Azerbaijan, here is another one of those, stale conflicts where the Russians are involved, intentionally creating the tension so that they can control their former Soviet satellite states. Estimates are as many as 80,000 troops in Armenia, 80,000 Russian troops in Armenia. You go over to Poland and the Czech Republic. We talked about them just a second ago. They had a missile defense shield planned. Russian generals threatened nuclear war. They're threatening nuclear war against our NATO allies. You look at the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These are countries that want their independence. They enthusiastically joined the European Union. They enthusiastically joined NATO. And in response, Russia shut off their energy, shut off their natural gas in the dead of winter. And friends, when you do this, people suffer and people die. The list goes on. The Eurasian Customs Union prevents Central Asian states from developing closer ties and relations with the West. If you look at Moldova, the Transnistria region, estimates are 15,000 Russian troops are in the Transnistria region, again creating a frozen conflict. This is something that happens over and over again. And the question is, what happens next? How many Russian speakers are in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia? Are those Russian speakers going to be protected in the same way that the Russian speakers were protected in Crimea? And what does that mean to the world's stability? It is the Obama administration's repeated demonstrations of weakness from New START to Nagorno-Karabakh that created the conditions that ultimately led to Crimea. What should Congress do? With the Russian economy floundering, congressional action could help strengthen Ukrainian resolve, reassure nervous European allies and friends, and deter further Russian aggression. Sanctions are important, but they offer diminishing returns. We need to be honest. The collapse in oil prices has caused far more damage to the Russian economy than sanctions ever could have hoped to have accomplished. The worst thing Congress could do is split the NATO alliance. That is the last thing we need to do. We need to keep the NATO alliance together and strong, and we don't need to push Moscow into the arms of Beijing, with whom Russia just signed a major natural gas deal on terms, quite frankly, favorable to China. Sanctions are easy for Congress to rally around, but we need a more comprehensive policy to change Russian behavior without damaging our relationships or making Russia into China's junior partner. In fact, some would argue that Russia could very well be becoming a client state of China. We can talk about that more in the question and answer session. Congress can also help strengthen Ukraine's position by authorizing loans necessary to reestablish basic services within territory retaken from the Russian-backed separatists. So when Ukraine does make progress, and they do take back territory, the United States could provide loans to the Ukrainian government for the purposes of building the infrastructure in those areas retaken by Ukraine. The IMF recently signed off on a $17 billion loan to Kiev. Congress should match the IMF's offer with the money earmarked to build support for the government in newly liberated areas of eastern Ukraine. Congress should also continue to push for lethal military aid to Ukraine's freedom fighters. Putin will only back off if the military balance turns decisively against separatists. U.S. non-lethal aid is not enough. As President Poroshenko told Congress, blankets and night vision goggles are important, but one cannot win war with blankets. Russian military activity in the skies and undersea is scaring our allies and friends, particularly those in the Baltics and around the Black Sea. From a reassurance standpoint, the best thing Congress can do is reduce Europe's dependence on Russian energy. Control a nation's energy supply and you control the nation. Russia knows that, they understand it, they've been using that as their tool. The Baltic countries rely on Russia for nearly 100% of natural gas imports. The Baltic states Our NATO allies rely on Russia for 100% of their natural gas. Many other European friends rely on Russia for more than half. Along with Senator Ted Cruz, I will be reintroducing the American Energy Renaissance Act, comprehensive energy legislation that would expedite natural gas export permitting, end the crude export ban, and streamline the process for exporting coal. Given the European preference for natural gas, I've also introduced H.R. 89 in this Congress, the Domestic Prosperity and Global Freedom Act, a bill that solely deals with ramping up natural gas exports. This exact bill passed the House multiple times in the last Congress. Finally, I intend to introduce a resolution showing congressional support for America's continued Article 5 commitments under NATO. If you attack one of us, you attack all of us. Congress can also help deter further Russian aggression. The most likely targets are the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, small countries containing significant Russian-speaking populations. That has been the trend. If there's a Russian-speaking population, Russia moves in to defend them, creating frozen conflicts. Russia's military strategy involves significant information warfare and propaganda operations. Information warfare and propaganda. After that, Moscow deploys its so-called little green men, special operators conducting unconventional warfare in support of proxy separatist forces. Robust cyber attacks paralyze a coordinated defense. Finally, Russia introduces artillery and heavy mechanized forces to create the new frozen conflict. In response to all of this activity, NATO wants to establish a new high-readiness, brigade-sized force to reinforce conventional deterrence. Rather than build yet another rapid reaction force, Congress should use the NDAA and the defense appropriations process to push European command to enhance its unconventional capabilities, specifically information operations and cyber offense and cyber defense. Ultimately, Congress is limited by President Obama, a man clearly uncomfortable with accepting America's natural and manifest role as a global superpower. He does not understand that America must lead wherever and whenever our allies and friends are too distracted, intimidated, or unwilling. Russia's new adventurism is a direct consequence of American weakness. So is the instability now stretching across the greater Middle East, into the Asia-Pacific, and increasingly into Central and South America. In every case, a series of weak responses by Barack Obama and his administration have compelled allies to question our commitment and encouraged adversaries to push the envelope still further. The Republican majorities in the 114th Congress must send an unmistakable message to President Obama and to the world. The American people and their representatives are unwavering in their determination that the government shall fulfill its constitutional obligation to provide for the common defense, whether against Russia or any other potential adversary, and will lead the free world from a position of unassailable strength. Thank you guys for having me. I'm looking forward to the questions in the panel.
Thank you, Congressman Bridenstine. We appreciate it. So we're gonna invite the rest of our panel up now. And Congressman Bridenstine will stay for our panel. Steve Bucci is our director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. Steve is going to serve as our moderator for this panel. Steve, over to you.
Okay, trying to do this real quickly to get you out in time for lunch. At the far end, we have my colleague, Cully Stimson. Cully is a senior legal fellow and the manager of our National Security Law Program here at Heritage. He is a Reserve Navy JAG Corps officer. He served as a state, local, federal, and military prosecutor, as well as a military judge specializing in sex crimes and homicides. He was the number 2 guy in the Reserve JAG Corps for the Navy and the Marine Corps. Next to him is Diem Solomon. Zem is our senior policy analyst for defense budgeting. She came to us from the Avocent Group, a leading independent strategy and management consulting firm. And I was an Army Green Beret for nearly 30 years, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, where I got involved in cybersecurity, and then worked for the IBM Corporation. And I, as mentioned, I'm the director of the Allison Center. We do all of defense, homeland security, plus Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. And we're going to each take about 3 to 5 minutes, give you a quick blurb on our subjects to get your minds going, and then go to questions. And we'll start with Cully.
Thank you, Steve. And Congressman, it's a pleasure to be on the same panel as a shipmate. Appreciate it. I've been asked to speak about sexual assault in the military and the right policies. We've produced a special report here at Heritage on that topic. It's available free, not only online, but downstairs in the lobby. I've sat with rape victims, male and female, as a local and state court prosecutor and helped vindicate their rights before the court and get justice. I've done that in the military. I've defended people accused of rape. And like Steve said, I've had the pleasure of being the Deputy Chief Judge in the Navy Marine Corps Trial Judiciary for the last 4.5 years, where most of the cases before the court are sexual assault or sexual assault related cases. So I've seen this problem up close and personal. We wrote our paper to educate Congress on the differences between the military justice system, which is unique, and the civilian criminal justice system, which is unique. Each has a different mission. The military exists to defend the nation, and that is the mission of the military. To accomplish that mission, leaders, such as the congressman when he was on active duty, must ensure that those who serve under them are combat ready, and once ordered into combat, are combat effective. Maintaining good order and discipline in the armed forces is essential to accomplishing that mission. Contrast, of course, the mission of a DA, an elected DA in a county. She, once elected, is charged with enforcing the criminal laws of that state in her courts through her prosecutors. She has nothing to do with the training and equipping of citizens in her county. She simply vindicates the rights of victims who are brave enough to come forward and prosecute those cases that are prosecutable, many of which are not. Incidents of sexual assault, I can assure you, are real, not only in the military but in the civilian context, and it's a real problem. We've seen the recent bogus Rolling Stone article, which, albeit not true, highlights the fact that sexual assault on college campuses is indeed true. One of the common themes about sexual assault in the military and in the college campuses is that they're usually acquaintances and there's alcohol involved. I think those are the two true truisms that take place in a lot of these cases. Our military justice system is a well-developed, unique, and integrated criminal justice system which handles thousands of crimes a year, from petty theft, drug, unauthorized absence, and yes, sexual assault. But Congress has to realize that it is fundamentally different than the civilian criminal justice system. And this is where I think Senator Gillibrand, her scheme is bad policy. Commanding officers in the military have a wide range of tools available to them, unlike a DA, to enforce good order and discipline. These include mild administrative remedies such as informal counseling, formal counseling, executive officers' inquiry, and non-judicial punishment, or NJP. And you can also fire people if they commit misconduct through an administrative processing board. But the ultimate power or remedy for any commanding officer is the power to immediately refer a case to courts-martial. Now, you hear Senator Gillibrand and her supporters say, well, we need independent prosecutors in the military, not a little handmaiden of the commanding officer. And that shows a gross lack of understanding of the military justice system. I bet you that she and no one who supports her scheme has ever even been to a court-martial. Prosecutors in the military are independent. They report to the chief prosecutor in the military. Taking the power away from the commanding officer, which is the Gillibrand scheme, and giving it to a so-called independent prosecutor eliminates an indispensable authority that cannot be delegated or transferred to another if we are to demand accountabilities from commanders for prosecuting and preventing sexual assaults and other serious crimes in their command. This notion of accountability, I think, is probably somewhat obscure to people in the civilian community who haven't served in the military, but those who have served completely understand it. Under the current systems, commanders have the legal responsibility and authority to refer criminal suspects to a court-martial, and they do so sometimes against the advice or recommendation of their JAG lawyer who's advising them. The reason is quite simple, and that is, in the civilian context, when I was a prosecutor, if a victim came to me and through the police and said that she had been raped, I can only go forward with that case as a prosecutor under the State Bar ethics rules if there's a reasonable likelihood of success on the merits. In other words, I know I can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's go over to the military side. On the military, a commanding officer, let's say he was a commanding officer, now not a congressman, he's not a lawyer. Commanding officers aren't lawyers, they're line officers. And all they have to have is probable cause to believe that that person committed that crime against that person. And if they say that they believe that there's probable cause to believe that the crime was committed, then they refer that case to a court-martial, and then it's transferred over to the prosecutor's office, independent of him, who then do the best they can in the cases. And I can tell you, if the Gillibrand scheme became law, and thank goodness it hasn't, what would result is fewer courts-martial and more victims. And so it's a good policy for sound bites, but in reality, it's terrible policy. Congress last year, and I'll end with this point, did a very good job upgrading and doing a comprehensive overview of the entire military justice system. Key reforms were put in place, including the reforms to what civilians would call preliminary hearings, what the military calls an Article 32 hearing. Many of those reforms haven't even taken effect. So now you have Senator Gillibrand and her supporters urging Congress to relook at divesting responsibility from commanders and putting it over to prosecutors, when in fact the very laws that were passed haven't even been fully implemented. And so I'll leave it at that, but I look forward to the questions and answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Zem.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you, Congressman, for your remarks. I think it sets the stage pretty well for a discussion on the defense budget. I think one of the most critical tasks for Congress this year is going to be finding a way to increase defense spending for fiscal year 2016. As a lot of you know, if a budget deal isn't agreed on, defense spending is going to return to the Budget Control Act levels that were set in 2011. And this is going to have some serious implications for our already degraded military. I'm just going to touch on 3 quick points. First, defense spending has been cut for the past 5 years, and not by a trivial amount. And second, returning to BCA levels of spending is really just bad defense budgeting policy, in my opinion. And lastly, in terms of fully funding defense, I actually think it can be affordable if you pass proper budget policies. So starting in 2010, we've cut defense spending by about 25%, from $757 billion to $565 billion. Now, take into account the amount that you've cut in such a short time frame, and the fact that the budget environment has been extremely uncertain for the past several years. This has had significant impacts on the military. So I'd leave you with one example. The military uses a two-war concept to determine how large the military should actually be. So under this concept, the U.S. military should be able to fight 2 wars in 2 separate geographical theaters at almost the same time. Given that we are a superpower with global interests, this makes sense. It gives the military and the president some flexibility. It also deters aggressive actors from taking advantage if the United States were to engage in war. This 2-war force sizing construct has been used since 1991, the end of the Cold War, and every administration has relied on it in some form or another. So in order to absorb the 25% reduction in defense spending, what the military has had to do is severely cut the size of the military across all 4 services, so Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marine Corps. Today, our military is so small that it can't meet its own 2-war force sizing requirements. returning to BCA levels of spending is just bad budget policy for the Defense Department. At this level, we would be holding the defense top line flat for 3 straight years in a row. Unfortunately, programs as well as people increase have real cost growth in the military. So in order to maintain a flat top line, DoD is going to have to continue internal cuts. This means additional reductions in force size. The Navy recently said that under BCA levels, they would go to a 10 aircraft carrier force size. This would also undo many of the recent gains the military has made in rebuilding their readiness. Simply put, at BCA levels, the military would again become a hollow force. I'd also note that BCA became law in 2011. But since 2011, a lot has happened. The congressman pointed out many of these events, but to give you additional examples, ISIS, the growth of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, or the invasion of Crimea by Russia, all have implications or requirements for the military that they'll have to address in one way or the other. And so by returning to a budget level that we've set back in 2011, prior to all of these things happening, you're creating a greater mismatch between what is required of our military and the actual resources that we're willing to give them. And lastly, on the issue of affordability, since 1948, the military spending has averaged 5.8% of our GDP. Under BCA levels, that would be 2.6%, which is nowhere near what we've historically spent. I don't want to say that we don't have a spending problem. We do have a spending problem. We have $18 trillion in national debt. But it's not possible to fix our spending problems on the back of defense. The main driver of our national debt, as you all know, is entitlement spending. We could zero out defense spending entirely and we would still have a spending problem. So the reality of it is, because we haven't passed any substantial entitlement reform, all these cuts that the military have had to endure actually gets us very little in fiscal responsibility. And so all of this taken into account, fiscal 2016 is really the time to increase the defense budget, and I think Congress has a great opportunity to do so next year.
Thanks. And thank you, Congressman, for covering an issue that I wanted to have one of my specialists deal with, nukes and missile defense, and she's out of town, so I'm thrilled that you covered it for us. I'm going to talk real quickly about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a real issue. We just had recently the Sony hack and now the CENTCOM Twitter and YouTube accounts hacked to at least keep it on the front page of the newspapers. Look, action's required. We need to do something. Our legislators need to do something about this. But very quickly, keep in mind, cybersecurity is not a partisan issue. Every bill that has come up has had strong bipartisan support, and every bill that has come up has had slightly bigger and stronger bipartisan opposition, so they haven't passed. The main problem that we're running into is the difference between folks who think a regulatory solution would work. We just set a federal standard and make everybody stick to it, by God, and we'll fine them if they don't. That does not work. It doesn't work in most situations. It darn sure will not work in a field as dynamic as cybersecurity. Additionally, we just have this wonderful desire to have one big, giant, comprehensive bill that fixes everything. It's really hard to do that in cybersecurity because it covers so much ground, touches so many constituents. We really have to break it up and get it in slightly more manageable pieces if we're ever going to get legislation that's going to be of a beneficial nature. We need to have better information sharing while still protecting civil liberties and privacy. We need to encourage and really build a cyber insurance industry that's real and valid and will drive the C-suite personnel of our corporations to make business decisions to improve cybersecurity. We've got to fix our supply chain security across the board because the global nature of the cyber supply chain, stuff gets built everywhere, is not going to go away unless you really want to pay $10,000 or $15,000 for the iPhone that's in most of your pockets. I don't think we want to go there. So we've got to fix that supply chain. We need to add a capability for some degree of active self-defense on the part of our corporations in America. In other words, they can fight back. Right now, they can only defend themselves. If they try and fight back at all, it's against federal law. That needs to change. It needs to be circumscribed. I'm not asking for the internet to turn into a free fire zone, but we need to have some capability to do that. We need to radically improve the awareness, education, and training of our entire nation, from the little 5-year-olds who are already on the internet and using mobile devices, all the way up to our grandparents who access their benefits from state and local institutions all online. We need to find a way to build a sufficiently robust cyber workforce. We have a problem with that now. There are a lot of the people we need in that cyber workforce that we can't get because they can't get a security clearance, because they were looking at somebody else's grades in their high school computer when they were 18, and now they have a problem. There are a lot of non-standard folks that we need to get into the fold here if we're going to do this as well as we need to. And the last point is we've got to have effective international engagement. I'll be honest with you, I didn't like that when we first put that in our documents here at Heritage, because there's a strong component in our government who thinks we should have cyber arms control and just make an agreement with other countries about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. Well, arms control doesn't work with arms. It's never going to work with cyber. It's just too easy to hide things and fake things. But we do have to have some sort of engagement on an international level, because if we don't, you'll be allowing China, Russia, and Iran to define what the internet is going to look like. And I don't think any of us want to give up the freedom and the access that the internet provides to us that fuels our economy to put it under that kind of regime. So with that, I'll stop, and we have a few more minutes to take questions before Tim will wave at me and give me the hook. So if you have a question, please stand and identify yourself. I'll acknowledge you, and you could ask away. Any questions?
I'm going to take the prerogative here. And is this on? Congressman Bridenstine, I think one of the big questions right now within the conservative movement is whether we remain a three legs of the stool conservative movement, or whether we take a different tact and kind of go in a little bit more of a libertarian direction. How do we, and you and I have talked about this, and we've been promoting this at Heritage Action and the Heritage Foundation. We want to be somewhat libertarian in our rhetoric because it's important. I mean, opportunity for all, favoritism to none. There is a libertarian flavor to that, right? But it's not at the expense of three legs of the stool traditional conservatism. It's completely consistent with our philosophy. Can you talk a little bit about how we maintain three legs of the stool within the movement and how we kind of reach out and make sure we don't shatter the movement around these lines?
It's a great question. When I talk to constituents, when they're concerned about defense spending, it's not so much they're concerned about the Department of Defense per se. What they're concerned about is the budget, the deficit, the $18 trillion debt, the idea that for 4 years now we've been printing cash to buy American Treasury bonds. This is what has America very, very concerned, the people that are paying attention. And they're not just buying American Treasury bonds, they're also, purchasing mortgage-backed securities and everything else these days. So this is an area where conservatives and libertarians see the world the same way, that we have deficit and debt problems. And what I would say is, as it was already attested to here on this panel, we're not going to solve that crisis by gutting defense. In fact, we'll only make it worse. Because when it comes to national security, if you look at what's happening around the world today, the longer we wait, the more we don't engage, the more costly it will eventually be in the future when we do engage. So the concern is not so much about whether or not we should be engaged in the world protecting American interests. The concern is about the debt and the deficit. And ultimately, it was correctly identified that we could eliminate the entire Department of Defense, and we will still have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of annual deficit. That is a fact. So the reality is what we need to do as a country is reform entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. These are the programs that ultimately, if we do not fix, will bankrupt our country. The United States is not immune to the same types of problems that we've seen in Europe, Greece, and elsewhere. We have to be very careful about managing our budget. Part of managing our budget is to make sure that as aggressors in the world become more aggressive, they're thwarted early and often, and that we're not just waiting until it becomes such a big crisis that it becomes unmanageable in the future.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
There's been a lot of long-standing problems in the Department of Defense that's really not been addressed, such as acquisitions and base closures, and can you address some of those issues that we've, since the Eisenhower administration, we've been dealing with these problems with in the Department of Defense?
Absolutely. From my perspective, certainly, I used to do acquisitions for the Department of Defense as a military guy. And I can tell you that there are a whole host of things that we do that are not, competitive in nature, that don't enable us to save money and get better products at a better price, and ultimately serve the warfighter better. There are entrenched interests to make sure that the status quo doesn't change. Those interests include an army of acquisition professionals, as well as contractors, people that come alongside the government to help purchase things, but also contractors that sell things to the government. So you have this very immobile kind of bureaucracy that is very difficult to manage. Ultimately, this is the kind of thing that is going to have to be reckoned with by the United States Congress. Certain things that we can do, for example, increase competition. And one thing I've been working on in the satellite sphere, I'm on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee within the Armed Services Committee. Instead of having a model where we're purchasing monolithic, huge, multi-billion-dollar satellites, owning and operating the multi-billion-dollar satellites, in the Department of Defense we have moved to a model where we're purchasing imagery, where we're purchasing data from the private sector. We're driving down the costs. That imagery is available to corporations, which shares the cost. The people that invest in these companies are not just the taxpayer, they're private companies. So they are sharing in the risk. So the more we can move towards a model such as that, where we are partnering with the private sector in ways that the DOD, look, the DOD was involved in the creation of the internet. But once the private sector got a hold of the internet, there was nothing the DOD was going to do to stop it from continuing to advance in ways that the DOD never imagined. And so we got to a position in the Department of Defense now, we used NIPRNet and SIPRNet, and these are internet networks managed by a private company that is able to do it much better than the DOD could do it. Satellite communications, I think, are the same way. There are things that we can do, but it's not going to be driven by the bureaucrats in the Pentagon who ultimately have an interest in maintaining the status quo. If that's what we're waiting for, it will never happen. It's got to be driven by members of Congress who are responsive to their constituents to drive down costs and increase the benefit to the warfighter. Ultimately, that's where it's going to have to happen.
All right, and with that, I unfortunately have to cut it off because you only have 15 minutes to eat before things start again at 1300. So thank you very much, and lunch is being served out in the lobby and will be available.